United States, which heterosexuals created and are to blame for it. And so I want to say what redefining marriage does is just it exacerbates all of the existing problems and takes it to a next level. Because what we're seeing is that same-sex couples have marriage equality. We're saying we want children of our own. We want to create a child of our own, raise the child from birth. A way of illustrating this is that you've heard of the contraception mandate. There's also a conception mandate. California, part of its implementation of Obamacare, said that every healthcare plan has to cover infertility treatments, regardless of the religious or moral convictions of the plan administrators or owners. So what this means is that every couple in the state of California is eligible for infertility treatments if they try for a year and are unable to conceive. So the same-sex couple tries to conceive for a year. If it still doesn't work out, they're then eligible for infertility treatments. What does that look like? Let's say it's a same-sex male couple. One of them can provide the sperm. They'll have to purchase someone's eggs, and they'll have to rent someone's womb. So a couple of things to say about this. First is that it tends not to be upper middle class, Ivy League educated women who are selling their eggs or renting their wombs. So there's a question about exploitation here. It tends to be poor, marginalized, frequently minority women in the United States and then overseas from India who are being used to be incubators or egg donors, selling their eggs. So there's a question here, if you're concerned about social justice, if you're concerned about the marginalized, we already have the problem with IVF and surrogacy in the first place. This now creates a new driver, a new kind of impetus behind it. But then second, there's a consequence of what happens to those children. Because most people don't want to be Octomom. Most people want to have one live-born child. But the way that this frequently works is that they'll create maybe a dozen embryos. They'll freeze half of them. So those unborn children will never see the light of day. They'll implant the other half, and then they engage in what the euphemism is selective reduction. They'll see which of the embryos that they implanted seems to be the best, the healthiest, the most robust, and they'll allow that one to continue developing, and they'll destroy the other embryos. So if you're concerned about the dignity and sanctity of unborn human life, you have to be concerned about how redefining marriage will create a new incentive for these problematic technologies to be further utilized and further abused. And then lastly, what about those children? What about that one child that is brought to life? That child is being created from the very moment of conception to be denied either a mother or a father. This is unlike anything else in our reproductive practices, because no one kind of creates an institution to incentivize single parenting or divorced parenting. We recognize that we're a fallen species. As fallen creatures, we can't always live up to our ideals, but no one tries to incentivize and encourage single parenting. We recognize that sometimes you need to have adoption because the natural parents are unable to raise a child. Sometimes you need to separate from an abusive spouse. Sometimes you need to, do things because of our fallen nature. Here would be a case in which from the very beginning, you're creating a child to be deprived of either a mother or a father intentionally. Not accidentally, not because of human frailty and weakness in the fall, but by design. And the way that I first recognized this point was by two young women. They're now probably in their 30s or 40s. Katie Faust and Heather Barwick, both of whom were raised by lesbian couples. So they both have two moms. And they both filed amicus briefs with the Supreme Court. I tell their stories in chapter 7 of my new book. And they said that same-sex marriage creates an institution for missing parents. It institutionalizes that missing parent. Heather was in favor of gay marriage growing up. She wanted her two moms to have the right to marry. It was only when Heather got married to a man and she saw how her husband was fathering her children that it kind of clicked for her firsthand what she had missed by not having a father. and she came out against same-sex marriage. She wrote an open letter to Justice Kennedy. She filed the amicus brief saying, as a child of two mothers, both of whom I still love, I don't think redefining marriage is a good idea, because redefining marriage will redefine parenting, which in turn will redefine children and childhood, and you're going to be incentivizing more children like me. I missed out on having a dad. If you now create same-sex marriage, more children like me will be created and will miss out on a father. And so again, you have to think about how does the law shape the culture and the beliefs and the actions of the people in that society at a conceptual level. So that's the third consequence. The fourth consequence, I'm just going to say very summarily so that we can stop and get to your questions in the last 15 minutes that we have. Because the whole next session is on this fourth consequence. And that's the consequence for religious liberty. And the only thing I'm going to mention here is that this is where you hear the stories of the bakers, the florists, the photographers, the adoption agencies, the nonprofit tax status of Christian schools. I'm going to go through all of that and more when we return from lunch. Let me just say now about the framework of all of those cases. What we have heard for the past 10, 15, 20 years is that if you're against same-sex marriage, you're just like the racist bigot who was against interracial marriage, and the law should treat you just like the law treats racist bigots. And so you only have to ask yourself, what are the religious liberty protections for racist bigots? What happened in the Bob Jones University Supreme Court case? And if you're not familiar with that case, don't worry, I'm going to go through it in this afternoon session. But you can see at the conceptual level, the argument here is going to be people who believe that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other inside of marriage, are just like racists and bigots and other people who engaged in unjust discrimination. And that logic will only take a little bit amount of time to play itself out, unless we do something about it. I mean, that's ultimately why we're having these 2 days of meetings here in Casper. It's why I do the work I do, and it's why I want to encourage you to do the work that you're doing. And so hopefully the 2 sessions after lunch will put more meat on the bones in terms of what to do to combat that. But now I just want to take your questions just on the understanding about marriage. Because I think before we can turn to the religious liberty, before we can turn to the kind of rebuilding the marriage culture, I just want to see what your questions are and how I can help you in talking about marriage without appealing to the Bible. This is interesting because as pastors, you're going to get questions about both the theology of marriage, but also we're going to say who don't share any of your theological starting points. Well, what's the truth about marriage as a philosophical matter? Yeah.
As a sociological and historical fact, even though homosexuality has existed forever, and in some cultures has been very favored,
Including the ancient Greeks.
None of those cultures pretended that it was marriage.
Yep. Including Socrates. Yep. I mean, so is there a question there or just the statement? Because I'll comment on the statement. Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And Justice Alito made this point during oral arguments. It's something that we make in our What is Marriage book. It's the idea that regardless of where you stand on the morality of same-sex relationships, no one throughout history thought they were marital relationships. So Socrates, as Plato reports, was rather okay with same-sex male relationships. But Socrates never thought they were marital relationships. And ancient Greeks in general, it was a homoerotic culture. There was man-boy love and man-man love going on, but they never thought it was a marital relationship. And Alito made that point during oral arguments. And the left wants to say, no, it's only homophobia. Because then they can use that narrative of it's just like racism. There were other questions here and then here.
Dr. Anderson, in your book, recent book, I was intrigued. In the early part, you talked about, you pushed back against the idea that it's over with.
Right.
And you make the statement that on many campuses, you have students come up and they say to you, I've never heard an argument for marriage. And I'm just curious, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons, but what's your perception? What do you think the the normal, the average push button that really pushes their button?
Whose button? The liberal or the conservative student?
Probably the liberal student.
So, I mean, and this took place a little bit last night at CSU during the Q&A. Many of them just assume that they're on the, quote, right side of history, that the only reason someone would disagree with them is because that person is stupid or bigoted. And they are shocked when they actually hear a rational argument on the counterpoint. Right? This is why you now see the trigger warnings and the safe places and the microaggressions. Our college campuses are really in a bad situation because any counter-argument is now viewed as an insult or an attack. And it's even worse on kind of social conservative issues. But it's not just on social. I mean, it seems to me that anything that dissents from a politically correct campus orthodoxy is now being viewed with suspicion on the elite institutions of higher education. That's why you see all the claims for safe places and trigger warnings and whatnot. But on this issue in particular, I think we've done a very poor job ourselves. So I don't want to say that this is just because of the campus culture being so toxic. Too many of us censored ourselves. You know, we engaged in self-censorship of, well, if I'm outspoken on this issue, it'll hurt my ability to evangelize. If I'm outspoken on this issue, maybe someone will come and target me for a lawsuit. If I'm outspoken on this issue, there'll just be a headache that I'd rather avoid. And so as a result, who was speaking for us in many cases? It was the Westboro Baptist Church. Right? And obviously, the Westboro Baptist Church doesn't actually speak for anyone in this room. I don't even think, I mean, they're a heretical organization in the very literal, formal sense of the term. This is the group that pickets funerals with the signs that say, God hates fags. Right? And so the reason I say they're very literal, formal heretics is that God hates no one. Right? So they're engaging in very formal heresy, but in addition to being uncivil. But if, let's say you're a secular liberal, you've never read the Bible, you've never gone to church, and all you know about Christians is what you see from the Westboro Baptist Church. You're going to think these people are really bigoted and evil, and we need the law to stop them. You're going to be much less sympathetic to the baker, the florist, the photographer, if you think that what's motivating them is their hatred for people. And so what I find on college campuses is that liberal students have just never heard an argument like the one that I present. Their professors aren't assigning my book. The arguments are out there, but when you have a biased syllabus, you're on your own. But also the conservative students are saying the same things. The conservatives are students saying, look, I've always known marriage is the union of a man and a woman. The Bible says so. My parents taught me that. The church bears witness to it. But I've never heard a secular argument. And so the parallel that I make throughout the new book, the Truth Overruled book, is to the pro-life movement. And this is, I'll get more into this in the last session, but many people thought after Roe v. Wade that the pro-lifers had lost and the issue was settled and it was over. And what I want to suggest is that no, this issue hasn't even started to be engaged by people on our side. Today, every one of us can make a secular argument in defense of unborn human life. Right? We all have the capacity to do that today. That took work, right? There were people in my parents' and my grandparents' generation who did that work to make it easy for me to be a pro-lifer. And now it's going to be people in my generation that have to do the work so that all of us can make a philosophical, social science, secular argument, in addition to the sacred argument about marriage. And that's hopefully what a session like today, and if you've read the book, hopefully those things are just tools that you can add to your toolkit, and that you can then pass on to the communities where you exercise authority. I mean, this can be everything that if you're doing a youth group ministry, you can help educate the children in your church about how to think about this. We're going to go here,
yeah, perhaps you've heard this, and I don't remember her name, but there's audio online of a lesbian activist talking to a bunch of other activists.
Masha Gessen, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the one. And
we lie about.
She says essentially, of course it's a given I believe in gay marriage, and then she corrects herself and says, well, actually, I believe marriage should be dismissed altogether and shouldn't even exist. and the place erupted in cheers.
Yep.
And so that to me is kind of a signal that this isn't really about redefining marriage, but about doing away with it. And I wonder if you would comment on that a little bit.
I think to a large extent, that's exactly right. I have my book on my Kindle app. I'm gonna see if I can pull it up to read it because the quote is actually really, it's revealing, and it's better than anything we could say ourselves. Let's see if I can find it. I'm not pulling it up right now. Maybe I misspelled her name. But so the basic idea here is that you have oh wait, no, I do it. Perfect. I was going to stop. It's Masha Gessen in 2012. And this is what she says. It's a no-brainer that same-sex couples should have the right to marry. But I also think equally that it's a no-brainer that the institution of marriage should not exist. Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we are going to do with marriage when we get there. Because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist. I don't like taking part in creating fictions about my life. That's sort of not what I had in mind when I came out 30 years ago. I have 3 kids who have 5 parents, more or less, and I don't see why they shouldn't have 5 parents legally. And then she goes on, I met my new partner, and she had just had a baby, and that baby's biological father is my brother, and my daughter's biological father is a man who lives in Russia, and my adopted son also considers him his father. So the 5 parents break down into 2 groups of 3. And really, I like to live in a legal system that is capable of reflecting that reality, and I don't think that's compatible with the institution of marriage. End quote. That's, so it's a perfect question because, that is the end result of consenting adults to do whatever consenting adults want to do, and that marriage is simply about consenting adult romance and caregiving. Her family structure, the 3 kids with 5 parents, I think her brother was the father to one of them. The idea of love equals love, and all those forms of love should be the same. Yeah.
The natural law argument that you've been making here is, I think, really effective for presenting this to people who are certainly who are not committed to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
The counter argument that I've heard when I've used that kind of argument, though, is that for most all of human history, recorded human history, the institution of marriage has been a vehicle for violence and oppression towards women and children. In the day of Jesus, I don't know if there was a single culture on earth where a man could not legally kill his wife with no repercussions at all. I was just reading recently about the pre-Christian Russian tribes where the standard practice was when a man died, his wife was automatically burned at the stake. And the reason for that was that was to prevent the wives from murdering their husbands, which was a pretty common problem because of the brutality that men usually... So following up on the question that we just heard, I think that the typical, especially the lesbian, the feminist argument for doing away with marriage is perhaps not so much that we should just be free to do whatever we like to do. That certainly I'm sure it's an underlying argument, but that the institution of marriage itself, from a natural law perspective, is an institution of brutality and violence. Yep. So how would you respond to that?
I would just distinguish between a natural law perspective and how humans behave naturally. So there's a difference between the historical, a natural law perspective isn't simply looking at how the majority of people throughout human history have behaved. So slavery violates the natural law. Part of the natural law is human equality.
Okay.
We're each individuals of profound and inherent worth. And yet we've seen slavery as an historical norm throughout human history. This is simply to say this is another kind of this is where G.K. Chesterton says original sin is the only Christian doctrine that's empirically verifiable, right? We fail to live up to the natural law. We violate the natural law at every turn. This is why, a theological point, this is why we need a redeemer. right? Because we fail to live up to the law that's written on the heart. St. Paul knew that. He wasn't saying that the law written on the heart is something that we always live out. So in the same way, I would say the fact that we've seen that marriage has been used as an institution for patriarchy or for abuse is simply to say that people weren't living out the truth about marriage. So there's two separate questions here. There's one question, a philosophical question of what is the truth about marriage? There's then a historical question of were people always living out every aspect of the truth about marriage? What I point out is that the male-female part of marriage was at least recognized as being true. Even when other parts of marriage, polygamous options at the top, was only elites who were, and you think about it this way, you could never have a society where everyone was in a polygamous relationship if there aren't enough women. So the math doesn't work out. So polygamy tends to be high-status men in a society of multiple wives, but then everyone else sorts out one man, one woman. But there's no denying that I think Christianity enters into a moral revolution in the ancient pagan world. It's where we get some of the first introduction of the ideas of equality that we don't see in Aristotle and Plato, for example. But that doesn't mean that those ideas are somehow just the domain of Christians. So Martin Luther King Jr., when he writes the letter from the Birmingham jail, he's appealing to the principle of equality. He says, he quotes both Augustine and Aquinas. And he says, an unjust law is a law that's not in accord with the divine law and the natural law. Right? And that's where he's explaining, he's like, look, so whether you're a theist or not, whether you're a Christian or not, we can all understand that these racist laws are unjust laws because they're not in accord either with the eternal law nor with the natural law. And that's all I think what we need to do is to take a lesson from Dr. King, Reverend King, and be able to make both the divine and the natural arguments. Yep, in the back.
How have they been so successful and so rapidly being able to do this? Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts, none of which is that well-formed. I mean, largely it's because they had a very systematic, well-organized, well-coordinated plan to do this. Read After the Ball. There was actually a strategy on how they were going to normalize same-sex relationships and then redefine marriage. And it's been a well-orchestrated campaign, like a public relations campaign, involving Hollywood TV shows and movies, involving elites, political elites, film elites, athletic elites, and then also involving stigma. So it goes back to your question of labeling anyone who dissents as a hater and a bigot and a homophobe and marginalizing them, so it becomes very costly for anyone to publicly dissent. I think if you put those things together, they silenced the opposition, they presented a very selective view of same-sex marriage, and they got all the cultural elites to say this is the, quote, right side of history. If you were a 14-year-old high school freshman, what are you going to think? I mean, all the sources of authority in your life are lined up to say that, you know, this is the truth, and that your parents, your church, your whatever is wrong.
But aren't they taught to question authority? Why don't they question
They're taught to question selective authorities, right? I mean, it's just the thing. I mean, the left on college campus is one of the most authoritarian movements in the world today. That's not the authority they're told to question. They're told to question their parents. They're told to question their church. They're told to question the Bible. I mean, those are it's question old conservative authorities, but embrace new liberal authorities. Yeah, right in the middle.
When we talk about marriage of a man and a woman and the benefit to the child, a lot of times people will throw back and say, well, then should infertile people or older people not be able to get married? And I feel like I could stagger my way to an answer on that, but maybe you have a nice articulate 3-sentence answer that we should write down.
I don't know if I have 3 sentences. It might take 4. But there is a section, it's at the end of chapter 1 or 2 of the Truth Overruled book, because that is one of the common objections. So, I have it takes about 2 or 3 pages. And there are 4 different ways of answering this. The first is that public policy is always made on the rule, not the exception to the rule. And that while not every marriage will produce a child, every child is the result of a male-female sexual union. And so public policy tries to maximize the likelihood that that male-female sexual union takes place inside of the context of a committed, permanent relationship. We call that marriage. So marriage policy is based on the rule, not the exception to the rule. The second is that inquiring into fertility would violate all sorts of privacy concerns that liberals themselves would never let you get away with. Right? So the state's interest has to be one step removed. So the state's going to say, if you're the type of relationship that has the capacity to create new life and unite new life with the mom and the dad, you qualify as a marriage. We're not doing fertility tests, because that would obviously violate privacy. The third is that if you followed the Aristotelian part of the argument, the nature of marriage itself is about a comprehensive union. Right? So a man and a woman become husband and wife on their marriage night, their wedding night, when they consummate the marriage, irrespective of whether 24 hours later a sperm fertilizes an egg, irrespective of whether 9 months later a child is born. So I'm going to make an Anglican joke. This is what got King Henry in trouble. Right? He wanted an annulment for his marriage because of infertility, but annulments were only granted because of impotency. So there's a difference. If you're impotent, you never consummate the marriage. And so impotency was grounds for an annulment. Infertility was never grounds for an annulment, neither canon law or the common law or civil law. Because if you were infertile, you would become one flesh. You had united as husband and wife. And it's just that the good that the thing is ordered towards, so the teleology, the telos of the union was unable to be realized for whatever reason. In King Henry's case, it was his fault. He was the one that was infertile. It wasn't his wife's fault. So that's the third thing, is that, well, actually, as simply as a sound philosophical matter, infertile marriages are still marriages. And then the fourth response is that there are no social costs to recognizing infertile marriages as marriages in law, whereas there are social costs in recognizing same-sex relationships as if they're marriages. The infertile marriage doesn't send the signal that men and women are interchangeable. It doesn't send the signal that fathers are optional. It doesn't send any of the negative social messages that I highlighted in the third part of the talk about the consequences of redefining marriage. Yep.
Sir, in the section when you talk about why it matters as a political institution, you talked about anthropological.
Yep.
I didn't catch.
Sure. So there's a anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. And so this is about human anthropology. And it's not simply because the Bible tells us that we're created male and female. I mean, this is one of those truths that, as I mentioned, the Vatican Conference, all of the world religions account for this truth within their own traditions, and sound philosophy and anthropology recognize that men and women aren't interchangeable, right? They're not the same thing. You don't need a Bible to realize that. I mean, I think any 5-year-old kid has realized that boys and girls are different. And that while they're equal, I mean, so the idea here is that men and women are equal in dignity, but that doesn't mean they have to be the same. I mean, I think there are two different strands within the feminist movement. There's kind of an androgynous feminism, which wants to deny differences between men and women. And then there's, in a Catholic context, what John Paul II called the new feminism, of saying that women are equal in dignity to men, but they have distinct gifts. And so you actually should value them as women because of what he called the genius of woman. And that rather than trying to water everyone down into being the same, we should actually know men and women are different, and they're valuable precisely because of their difference. And what marriage does is unite these the true halves of humanity as one in a way that brings great benefits to children. And so that's it's anthropology in the sense of the study of humanity. And then we'll go in the back.
Okay, in any of your sessions today, are you going to touch on the challenges that the transgender community is presenting to us? Specifically thinking about what happened in Houston.
Yes, so thinking about what happened in Houston, that's going to be in both of the sessions, actually. Because, and the short answer to this is that what happened in Houston needs to happen everywhere. If your city council or your state house is planning, and I know yours is, right? So if they're planning on adding sexual orientation and gender identity to existing non-discrimination ordinances, that needs to be defeated. Because that is the type of policy that is then used to shut down Catholic charity adoption agencies and to penalize the baker, the florist, and the photographer, and to then force the schools into having biological males who identify as girls in the locker rooms and the bathrooms and all the rest. So yeah, beyond that, I mean, I'm not an expert on transgender issues. I'm somewhat familiar with some of the good literature on this. But it's kind of I mean, it's interesting right now that you see there are gay activists who want to kick the T out of LGBT. Because they say the LGBT part's really successful right now. We have lots of sympathy. And it's the T that's really controversial. So there's some guy who's actually organized a petition to kick the transgender community out of the lesbian, gay, bisexual. Yeah, I think you might be the last question for this morning.
Sure, thank you. I really love these argumentations, and I fully endorse it. How do you handle the nature of the fact that we believe in natural law, that there are moral norms and absolutes, but in a cultural relativism kind of society, how do we take the argumentation we've just gone through, which is powerful, and combat the relativists?
Yeah. Great question. And so there are going to be different strategies. So one is, long-term, high-level strategy is better education. I mean, so there would be a whole separate talk about why school choice policies would be a great thing, right? Empower parents, respect parental authority, get your kids out of government-run public schools and actually educate them for real, right? And then send them be deliberate about where you send your kids to college. I mean, so if you don't want to raise a moral relativist, see to it that they get a good education. Because it's interesting, moral relativism is a Johnny-come-lately in terms of, even people who disagree with us, they weren't relativists. Nietzsche wasn't a relativist. They believed truth existed even when they disagreed with our conception of it. Nietzsche was a nihilist, so it's questionable what type of truth he believed in, but he thought the truth might be that there is no meaningful truth. But he wasn't a relativist, right? On a more immediate sense, I think most people claim to be relativists, but aren't actually. So they say it was unjust to not have marriage for same-sex couples. They say you are being bigoted if you're against same-sex marriage. Those are value judgments. Those are moral judgments. They're not saying, well, if you're against it, I'm in favor of it, who am I to judge? It's all morally relativistic, right? They're selective relativists. They're relativists when it comes to traditional norms that they don't like, but they have no problem imposing their morality on you, right? And that's what we're seeing with the baker, the florist, and the photographer. And so I would just say, all right, so what do you say you're in favor of marriage equality? Well, tell me, what's the foundation of this equality norm? Why is it that we have to treat people equally? Start asking them questions, and then say, all right, well, if you say we need to treat all marriages equal, tell me, what is a marriage? And how do you know what a marriage is? And does marriage equality extend to the throuple or not? And if not, why not? Why does marriage, tell me what your definition of marriage, put them on the side of having to actually answer some of these questions. That's where I find, going back to your question, the students have never had to answer these things. They have been very comfortable in just mouthing and repeating the